Story 1. The Midnight Passengers. My name is Ethan Porter, and I'm 29 years old. I live in Chicago, Illinois, and like most people, I look forward to celebrating New Year's Eve. This year, though, it became a night I'll never forget. It was nearing 11 p.m., and I was on the Blue Line heading downtown to a friend's rooftop party. The train station at Jefferson Park was eerily quiet for New Year's Eve. Snow dusted the platform, and the flickering lights made the long shadows of the few passengers stretch unnaturally. A man sat slouched on a bench nearby, his greasy cap pulled low over his face. He muttered to himself, his voice a low drone, like a broken radio. Standing further away was a young woman in a red coat, pacing nervously, glancing at her phone every few seconds. Her jittery movements caught my attention. Then, the muttering man stopped. He turned slightly and spoke, but not to me. His voice was sharp and deliberate, directed at a shadowy figure leaning against the far wall. "Not here. Too open. You hear me?" His words cut through the heavy silence. The man leaning against the wall, tall and gaunt in a black hoodie, gave a slow nod. "I hear you," he replied, his voice like gravel. My stomach nodded. I tried to look away, but something about the way they moved, the way their eyes flicked toward the woman in the red coat, made my skin crawl. "She's perfect," the hooded man whispered. "Right where we want her." I felt the air around me grow heavy, suffocating. My instinct screamed to intervene, but how? My heart pounded as I forced myself to walk toward the woman. "Hey! Rachel! Is that you?" I said loudly, plastering on a smile. She turned, startled. "I think you have the wrong person." I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "Listen, two men are watching you. They're planning something. Just act like you know me." Her eyes widened in fear. She hesitated, then nodded slightly, her lips trembling. Ethan. "Oh my gosh, I can't believe it's you," she said. I turned to him, trying to steady my voice. "No problem. Just catching up with an old friend." The man on the bench rose, his movements slow and deliberate. His cap tilted back just enough for me to see his eyes, empty, cold, devoid of humanity. He smiled, revealing teeth stained yellow. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "Neither of you should." The train's headlights appeared in the tunnel, casting long, flickering shadows over the platform. The woman gripped my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Just ignore them," I whispered to her. The train screeched to a halt, and the doors hissed open. I guided her toward the nearest car, but the hooded man stepped in front of us. "You really think you can just walk away?" he said. His voice low and menacing. "People like you, meddlers, don't get second chances." My breath caught in my throat. "We're getting on that train," I said firmly, though my voice wavered. The hooded man tilted his head, as if considering my words. Then he stepped aside with a mockingly polite gesture. "Be my guest." We hurried onto the train, and the doors slid shut. I glanced back just as the hooded man pressed his face against the glass. His smile stretched wider than seemed humanly possible. "You'll see us again," he mouthed. The train lurched forward. And I slumped into a seat, my heart hammering in my chest. The woman sat across from me, her face pale and her eyes darting around the car. What the hell just happened?" she stammered. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I'm glad we're away from them." The train lights flickered, then went out completely, plunging us into darkness. A murmur of confusion spread among the passengers. And then the train ground to a halt. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This isn't happening." "It's probably just a power issue," I said, though I didn't believe my own words. A metallic creak came from the door between the cars. My stomach sank. "They're here," she said, clutching my arm. "They're on this train." The door slid open, and the faint glow of emergency lights revealed the hooded man and his accomplice standing in the doorway. The hooded man grinned, his teeth glinting in the dim light. "Funny how the train stopped right where we needed it to," he said. "No one's going anywhere now," the other man added, stepping forward. "What do you want?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. The hooded man chuckled. "You think this is about what we want?" "No. It's about what you've done." "What are you talking about?" the woman asked, her voice cracking. "Oh, Rachel, or whatever your name is, you know exactly what we mean," he said, his smile vanishing. "Don't you remember?" Her face went pale, and she shook her head. "I don't know you. I've never met you." "That's the funny thing about guilt," the hooded man said. "It follows you, even if you forget. And tonight, it's caught up." Before I could react, the lights flickered back on, and the two men were gone. The train jolted to life, moving again as if nothing had happened. The woman stared at me, her eyes wide with terror. "Did you hear what he said?" she whispered. "What did he mean?" "I don't know," I said, though doubt gnawed at me. "Maybe they were just trying to scare us." She didn't respond, and neither of us spoke for the rest of the ride. When we reached the next station, she got off without a word, disappearing into the night. I reported the incident to the police, but there was no record of the two men, or even of the train stopping. To this day, I don't know who they were or what they wanted. But sometimes, late at night, I hear their voices in my dreams, whispering about things I don't remember, but feel I should. Story 2. It was New Year's Eve of 2016 when my girlfriend, Emma, and I traveled to the Scottish Highlands to visit my brother, Ryan, and his new fiancée, Claire. Ryan had moved there 2 years prior, and this was the first time Emma and I would meet Claire. He had always been the adventurous type, and the isolated charm of the Highlands suited him perfectly. We planned to celebrate the night by hiking to an abandoned lighthouse by the cliffs and watching the fireworks from the edge of the sea. "You're going to love this place," Ryan said as we packed our supplies for the hike. "It's eerie but beautiful. Perfect for a night like this." Claire chimed in, "Just watch your step. The path gets tricky after dark. And the locals say the area's haunted." She laughed, but there was a strange look in her eyes that I couldn't quite place. We left just before 10 p.m., bundled in layers to fend off the cold. The moon hung low, casting an otherworldly glow over the frozen terrain. The walk was invigorating at first, the crunch of snow underfoot, the distant roar of waves, and the occasional hoot of an owl. But as we neared the cliffs, the air grew heavier, and the sense of isolation became palpable. We were halfway to the lighthouse when we noticed someone standing on the path ahead. The figure was draped in a long, dark cloak, their face obscured by a hood. "Who could that be?" Emma whispered, clutching my arm. Ryan called out, "Hey there. Are you all right?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, they tilted their head slightly, as if observing us. Their breath was visible in the cold night air, slow and deliberate. "Let's just keep walking," Claire said, her voice trembling. As we passed, the figure didn't move but seemed to follow us with unseen eyes. My heart raced, and I noticed Emma glancing back repeatedly. "It's probably just some hermit," Ryan said, trying to reassure us. "People up here are quirky." But even he didn't sound convinced. We reached the lighthouse just before 11 p.m. It was derelict but still standing tall, its rusted frame silhouetted against the starry sky. We set up a small fire pit and unpacked our drinks. The tension eased as we toasted to the coming year, laughing and sharing stories. It was Emma who first noticed the distant light. "Do you see that?" she asked, pointing toward the woods beyond the cliffs. A faint glow flickered through the trees, accompanied by the low hum of chanting. We all turned to look, the laughter dying instantly. "What the hell is that?" I murmured. Ryan frowned. "Probably campers. Let's just ignore it." But curiosity gnawed at me. "I'm going to check it out." "Don't be stupid," Emma hissed. "Stay here." "I'll be quick," I said, grabbing my flashlight. Ryan hesitated before saying, "I'll come with you." "Be careful," Claire whispered, her voice tinged with worry. "If anything looks dangerous, just come back." We left the girls by the fire and headed toward the woods. The chanting grew louder as we approached, rhythmic and guttural, unlike any language I'd ever heard. We crouched behind a boulder and peered through the trees. A circle of cloaked figures surrounded a blazing fire. At the center, a man knelt, his hands bound, his head bowed. "This isn't normal," Ryan whispered. "We need to leave." I hesitated. Whispering back, "What are they doing? Is that guy in trouble?" Ryan shook his head. "I don't know, but this isn't something we want to mess with. Let's go." As if hearing him, one of the figures turned and looked directly at us. Even from a distance, I could feel the weight of their gaze. They raised a hand, pointing in our direction. "They saw us," I whispered. Panic rising in my chest. "Run," Ryan said, pulling me to my feet. We bolted back to the lighthouse, the chanting now replaced by the sound of footsteps crashing through the underbrush. "They're coming," Ryan shouted as we reached the fire. "What happened?" Claire demanded, her face pale. "They saw us," Ryan gasped. "We have to go. Now." Emma's voice trembled. "Who saw you? What did you see?" "A group of people," I said hurriedly, grabbing her arm. "They were doing some kind of ritual. They're coming after us." "What?" Claire's voice rose in panic. "Why? What do they want?" "I don't know," Ryan snapped. "Let's move before we find out." The four of us sprinted toward the path, the cloaked figures in pursuit. Their movements were unnaturally fast, gliding over the rough terrain as if weightless. One of them let out a guttural scream that echoed through the night, freezing my blood. "They're gaining on us," Emma cried. "Don't look back," Ryan barked. "Just keep running." "I saw a knife," Claire gasped, tears streaming down her face. "One of them had a knife." "Just focus on getting away," I shouted, though fear gripped me. We reached the cliffs and veered onto the narrow path leading back to the village. The moonlight barely illuminated the way, and every step felt perilous. I risked a glance back and saw one of the figures stop and raise an arm. A sharp, metallic sound sliced through the air as a knife embedded itself in the tree beside me. "Oh my God," Emma sobbed. "They're trying to kill us." "Faster," Ryan yelled, grabbing Claire's hand to pull her along. We didn't stop until we reached the edge of the village, where the warm glow of streetlights greeted us like a beacon of safety. The figures stopped at the tree line, their silhouettes watching us silently before disappearing into the shadows. Back at Ryan's house, we locked every door and window, sitting together in tense silence. Claire broke the quiet. "What did you see?" I described the chanting, the fire, and the bound man. "They don't want witnesses." Claire hugged her knees, rocking slightly. "I saw their eyes. They didn't look human." That night, none of us slept. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind set our nerves on edge. The next morning, we debated calling the police but decided against it. What could we even say? To this day, I don't know who those people were or what they were doing. But sometimes, late at night, I'll dream of that lighthouse, the fire, and those figures in the woods. And I'll wake with the unshakable feeling that they're still out there, watching, waiting. Story 3. A haunting New Year's encounter. The clock struck midnight, and the cheers of revelers echoed through the frosty streets of White Hollow, a small, secluded town blanketed in snow. Emma, a 26-year-old waitress, had just finished a grueling shift at the town's only diner. She was used to dealing with rowdy New Year's crowds, but tonight felt different. As she wiped down the last table, her coworker Lucas approached, yawning. "You good, Emma? Want me to wait with you for your cab?" Lucas asked. Emma smiled weakly. "Thanks, but I'll be fine. My ride's only 10 minutes away." Lucas nodded and headed out. The diner's doorbell jingled, and Emma was alone, except for the faint hum of the neon sign outside. She pulled out her phone to check the time. The cab was delayed by another 15 minutes. Sighing, she locked the door and sat near the window, her gaze drifting to the empty street. That's when she noticed him. A man stood beneath the flickering street lamp, his figure obscured by a heavy coat and wide-brimmed hat. His head was tilted downward. But she could feel his eyes on her. Shivering, Emma looked away, trying to convince herself it was just another late-night wanderer. Minutes passed, but when she glanced back, he hadn't moved. "Apologies, ma'am. There's been an incident on Main Street, so they're rerouting. Shouldn't be more than 20 minutes. Emma's stomach sank. She hung up and glanced outside. The man was gone. Relief flooded her, but it was short-lived. The sound of tapping came from the diner's glass door. Her breath hitched as she turned to see the man standing there. His face shadowed but his posture unnervingly still. "We're closed," she called out, her voice trembling. He didn't respond. Instead, he raised a gloved hand and knocked again, slower this time. Each knock reverberated through the diner like a heartbeat. Emma grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter and inched closer to the door. "What do you want?" she demanded. The man tilted his head, finally stepping into the light. His face was pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to peer straight into her soul. "A cup of coffee," he said, his voice raspy and low. "Just one cup. I'll pay." "We're closed," she repeated, clutching the knife tighter. His lips curled into a faint smile. "Please. It's New Year's Eve. Surely you wouldn't turn away a traveler on such a night." Against her better judgment, Emma unlocked the door just enough to speak through the crack. "Fine. One coffee, and you're out." The man nodded and stepped inside, moving with an unnatural grace. Emma hurried behind the counter, her eyes never leaving him as she poured the coffee. He took a seat at the far end of the diner, his movements deliberate and unnervingly quiet. "Here," she said, sliding the cup toward him. He didn't touch it. Instead, he stared at her, his expression unreadable. "Thank you. It's rare to find kindness these days." Emma forced a smile. "Happy New Year," she muttered, hoping he'd drink and leave. But he didn't. "Do you believe in second chances?" he asked suddenly. Her brow furrowed. "What?" He leaned forward, his eyes glinting with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Have you ever wished for a chance to change a decision? To undo a mistake?" Emma's grip on the counter tightened. "I don't know what you mean," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He smiled again, wider this time. "You will." The lights flickered, and a cold draft swept through the diner. When Emma blinked, the man was gone, the cup of coffee untouched. She ran to the door, locking it and checking the street. It was empty, save for her cab finally pulling up. Shaking, she climbed into the back seat and gave the driver her address. As they drove through the quiet town, she tried to rationalize what had happened. But as they neared her apartment, the driver suddenly stopped. "Hey, miss," he said, his voice uneasy. "You sure this is your place?" Emma looked out the window and froze. The building was dark and dilapidated, nothing like her home. A figure stood on the sidewalk, illuminated by the headlights. It was the man, his hollow eyes locked onto hers. Before she could scream, the driver turned to her, his face pale. "He's been following us since the diner." The man raised his hand, and the headlights flickered off. Darkness consumed the car as Emma's breath caught in her throat. Then, from the blackness, his voice echoed. "You should have never let me in." The next thing she knew, she was alone. The car, the driver, and the man were gone. Only the cold, empty street remained. Emma stumbled back to her apartment, locking every door and window, but the feeling of being watched never left her. To this day, she avoids working on New Year's Eve. And every so often, she dreams of a gaunt face staring at her through the diner's window, waiting for her to let him in again. Story 4. It was my first year of college when I discovered the allure of house parties. I wasn't the most popular guy, but I had a knack for blending into the crowd. One house, in particular, became a legend among students, the house at the end of Chestnut Lane. It belonged to a guy named Daniel, a quiet and bookish senior. No one understood how someone so reserved managed to throw the wildest parties on campus, but we weren't about to question it. The house had one rule: never go into the basement. Daniel didn't elaborate, and no one dared to ask. Some joked it was where he kept his collection of cursed artifacts, others thought it was just a ruse to keep people intrigued. But the rule gave the place a strange allure, and an undercurrent of unease. One cold October night, Daniel hosted his annual Halloween party. The house was packed with costumed students, witches, vampires, and skeletons mingling under dim, flickering lights. I arrived late, as usual, already a few beers deep. The air buzzed with laughter and the thump of music. "Scott! Over here!" a friend shouted, waving me over to a group near the kitchen. "What's up, man?" I slurred, grabbing another drink from the counter. "Dude, you've gotta try the punch. Daniel's special recipe," he said with a grin. I took a sip, sweet, tangy, and laced with something stronger than fruit juice. As the night wore on, I wandered through the house, the alcohol loosening my inhibitions. The basement door caught my eye. It was an old, heavy thing, slightly ajar. A faint, rhythmic tapping sound came from the other side, barely audible over the music. My curiosity flared. "Don't even think about it," came a voice from behind me. I turned to see Daniel, his eyes sharp and unblinking. "What's down there?" I asked, feigning innocence. "Nothing you need to worry about," he said curtly. "Just enjoy the party." "You're so mysterious about it," I said, trying to sound casual. "What's the big deal?" Daniel stepped closer, his voice lowering to a hiss. "Scott! Don't test me. I'm serious. Stay out." His intensity sent a shiver down my spine. I nodded, but the seed was planted. Why was he so protective of that basement? I decided I'd find out. Around midnight, the party began to thin out. Most people had moved to the backyard for the bonfire. I lingered inside, pretending to be drunker than I was. When I was sure no one was watching, I crept back to the basement door. The tapping sound had grown louder, more insistent. I pushed the door open. The staircase descended into darkness, the air thick and musty. I hesitated, but the pull of curiosity was too strong. I pulled out my phone, turning on the flashlight, and began my descent. "Scott, where are you?" a voice called from upstairs. I froze. Heart pounding. It was Daniel. He sounded closer than he should have been. "Just looking for the bathroom," I shouted back. Silence followed. Then, footsteps retreated. Relieved, I continued down. The stairs creaked under my weight, the tapping now almost deafening. At the bottom, the room opened into a narrow hallway lined with doors. Each door was marked with strange symbols, etched deep into the wood. My pulse quickened. The tapping was coming from the door at the far end, slightly ajar. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I approached the door, pushing it open with a trembling hand. Inside, the room was barren except for a single chair in the center. On it sat an old, dusty tape recorder. The tapping had stopped. I stepped closer and pressed play. A distorted voice crackled through the speaker, "You shouldn't be here." Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me. I whipped around, my flashlight flickering. The symbols on the walls began to glow, pulsating with an eerie red light. The air grew colder, and whispers filled the room, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. Panic set in. I banged on the door, shouting for help. "Scott, you idiot," Daniel's voice growled from the other side. "I told you not to come down here. Let me out." I screamed. "It's too late now," he said. His voice eerily calm. "They've seen you." "What? Who?" I shouted. "Daniel, what's going on? What is this?" There was silence for a moment. Then his voice came again, almost regretful. "I tried to keep you safe. But you wouldn't listen." "Safe from what?" I demanded, my panic rising. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony. Shadows began to coalesce in the corners of the room, taking vaguely human forms. One of them stepped forward, and I could hear its voice now, clear as day. "We've waited so long," it said. Its tone guttural and cold. "Daniel. Please." I screamed. "Help me." "I can't," Daniel replied, his voice distant. "You're theirs now." The shadow raised a hand. Its featureless face inches from mine. Its touch was like ice, and everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying on the couch in Daniel's living room. The party was over, the house eerily quiet. I sat up, my head pounding. The basement door was closed, the hallway empty. I stumbled outside into the cold dawn. A few stragglers lingered by the dying bonfire. "What happened to you?" my friend asked, handing me a bottle of water. "I don't know," I muttered. I looked back at the house. Daniel stood in the doorway, watching me. His expression was unreadable. But his eyes held a warning. I never went back to one of his parties, and I never spoke about what happened that night. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear the tapping. Story 5. New Year's Eve was supposed to be a night of celebration, but for me, it was a reminder of how far I was from the warmth of home. The countdown downtown was my attempt to fill the void, though I knew it would be fleeting. After the fireworks lit up the sky and strangers embraced in joy, I trudged to the bus stop, ready to leave behind the revelry that wasn't mine to share. When the bus arrived, its dim interior was eerily quiet. Only one other group of passengers caught my eye, a couple sitting at the very back. At first, I dismissed them. But their unsettling stillness gnawed at me. The man's grin was unnervingly wide, and the woman, dressed in a crimson dress, wore sunglasses though it was the dead of night. I tried to focus on the faint Christmas music playing from my phone, but when the bus hit a bump and her sunglasses fell, my stomach dropped. The woman's eyes, if you could call them that, were hollow, black pits. Blood trickled from them like tears, staining her pale face. "Happy New Year," the man suddenly called out. his voice smooth and mocking. His grin widened as he gestured toward me. Don't be shy, sweetheart. Come back here. It's a new year. Time for new friends. I hesitated but felt compelled to approach. My footsteps felt heavy, as if the air itself was resisting my movement. When I reached them, the man leaned forward, his grin now revealing yellowed teeth. You look lonely, he said. His tone syrupy but laced with something sinister. Out here all by yourself on a night like this. Seems unfair. I'm fine, I replied, my voice trembling. Just heading home. The woman tilted her head abruptly, the motion unnatural, like a doll's. Her lips curled into a smile, and for the first time, she spoke. Her voice was a whisper, raspy and fragmented. Home? No one's waiting for you there. What? I blinked, trying to convince myself I'd misheard. How do you know that? The man chuckled darkly. She's right, you know. Empty apartment. Empty life. Don't worry, though, we'll keep you company. Won't we, darling? The woman nodded, her hollow eyes somehow fixed on me. Stay, she whispered. It's safer with us. I really need to get off. I stammered, turning toward the front of the bus. The man's tone turned sharp. You're not going anywhere. I froze, heart pounding. Excuse me? You heard me, he said, leaning back casually. You don't want to get off this bus. Trust me on that. Outside, it's worse. What's worse? I demanded, my voice shaking. The woman leaned closer. Her head snapping to the side with a sickening crack. You'll see, she whispered, her voice dripping with malice. Panic surged through me. I don't want to be part of this. Whatever this is. Just leave me alone. The man clapped his hands, the sound echoing in the empty bus. Oh, but you're already part of it. You sat down. You spoke to us. That's enough. I'm getting the driver. I said, stepping back. Go ahead, he said, his grin never faltering. But ask yourself this, what happens when you turn your back on us? I glanced at the woman. Her smile widened unnaturally. Her jaw stretching far beyond what was humanly possible. Her hollow eyes began to weep fresh streams of blood, and her whisper turned to a chilling chant, Stay. 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 Enough. The man snapped, silencing her. He turned to me, his voice calm but icy. You're going to help us. My girlfriend's had a little too much fun tonight. She needs a hand getting home. No. I said firmly, despite the tremor in my voice. His grin faded. I wasn't asking. The woman's head lolled to the side, landing on the man's shoulder. Her voice was faint but clear. You'll regret saying no. I stepped back further, shaking my head. I'm not helping you. I'm not getting involved. The man's eyes darkened, and his voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. Wrong answer. Suddenly, he slammed his fist against the window beside him, shattering the glass. Look at what you made me do, he roared. The sound of breaking glass jolted the bus driver into action. Hey, the driver shouted, glancing back. What's going on back there? Knock it off, or I'm calling the cops. The man ignored him. Standing and towering over me. This doesn't have to get messy, he said, his voice eerily calm again. Just help me, and we'll let you go. The driver brought the bus to a screeching halt. I've had enough of this, he barked. All of you, off my bus. Now. The man stared at the driver, a dangerous glint in his eye. You sure about that, old man? I'm sure, the driver said firmly. Pulling out his phone. Or do I need to call the cops? The man's grin returned, and he hoisted the woman onto his shoulder. Her head hung limply, her bloodied eyes still fixed on me. I sank into my seat, trembling, unable to shake their parting words. When I finally got home, I locked every door and window and collapsed onto my bed. But sleep didn't come easily. My blood ran cold. I had seen her. Spoken to her. But how could that be? Then, as if on cue, a faint whisper echoed through my apartment. Stay. Story 6. The invitation came with a smile. Oliver and I had been seeing each other for a few months, and he had always been charming in his peculiar way. He wasn't conventionally handsome. But there was something magnetic about his lopsided grin and calm voice. So, when he asked me to join his family for their New Year's Eve dinner, I said yes, albeit with a bit of hesitation. The house was far from town, sitting at the end of a narrow, shadowy lane. It looked ancient, its wooden frame sagging as if weighed down by time. Oliver opened the door before I could knock. His smile wider than usual. "You're here," he said, pulling me inside with an enthusiasm that felt off. The smell hit me first, a mix of damp earth and something metallic, like rust. I wrinkled my nose, trying not to gag. Oliver noticed. "Sorry about the smell," he said lightly. "The house is old. It has its quirks." Before I could respond, a pale woman shuffled into the hallway. Her eyes were sunken, her lips cracked, and her movements were unnaturally slow. She stared at me for an uncomfortable moment. "Is this her?" she rasped, her voice barely audible. "Yes, Mom." "This is Emma," Oliver replied, his grip tightening on my arm. The woman's hollow eyes scanned me from head to toe before she muttered, "She'll do," and vanished into the shadows. My stomach churned. But Oliver was already leading me into the dining room. The room was dimly lit by flickering candles. A long wooden table sat in the center, set with mismatched plates and strange-looking dishes. Oliver's father sat at the head, motionless, his milky eyes fixed on something unseen. His younger sister stood in a corner, humming a tuneless melody as she twisted her fingers into impossible shapes. "Sit," Oliver said, pulling out a chair for me. "Dinner's almost ready." I hesitated but sat down. The air in the room felt heavy, oppressive. The younger sister suddenly stopped humming and turned to me, her grin unervingly wide. "Do you like clocks?" she asked. I guess," I replied, forcing a smile. Her grin stretched further. "Good. Clocks like you too." I glanced at Oliver, who chuckled. "Don't mind her. She has a unique sense of humor." Before I could respond, his mother entered, carrying a tray. On it were dishes that made my stomach turn, pale, gelatinous cubes, a steaming broth that smelled of rust, and what looked like raw meat. She placed the tray on the table and leaned down to whisper something to Oliver. He nodded solemnly. "What did she say?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. Oliver smiled. "She said it's time." "Time for what?" "You'll see." The younger sister sat across from me, her unblinking eyes fixed on mine. "Do you hear it?" she asked suddenly. "Hear what?" I asked, glancing around nervously. "The ticking," she said, tilting her head. "It's always ticking." I began, but Oliver placed a finger to my lips. "Shoo, listen," he whispered. The room fell silent. At first, I heard nothing. Then, faintly, I caught it, the rhythmic ticking of a clock. It grew louder, echoing in my ears, though I couldn't see any clocks in the room. "Where is it coming from?" I asked, my voice shaking. Oliver leaned closer, his breath warm against my ear. "It's inside you." I jerked away, my heart racing. "What's going on, Oliver? Your family, they're not normal." "They're special," he said, his voice soft yet firm. "And soon, you'll be special too." The family began to murmur in unison, their voices blending into an unsettling chant, "Forever and ever. Forever and ever." "What are you saying?" I demanded, standing abruptly. Oliver grabbed my wrist, his grip unyielding. "It's our tradition," he said, his tone unervingly calm. "You'll understand soon." "I don't want to understand. Let go of me." I tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. His mother stepped forward, her expression blank. "Don't struggle, dear. It's easier if you don't." "What's easier?" I cried, my voice rising in panic. His father spoke then, his voice deep and hollow. "The clock chooses. The clock takes. And the clock gives." "I don't understand." I screamed, tears streaming down my face. "You don't have to," Oliver said, pulling me closer. "Just trust me." The younger sister began to laugh, a high-pitched, maniacal sound that made my skin crawl. "She's perfect," she shrieked. "The clock loves her." The ticking grew deafening, pounding in my ears. Oliver's grip on my wrist became painful. His fingers like a vice. "Forever and ever," he whispered, his voice almost reverent. "No!" I screamed, twisting and struggling with all my strength. "Let me go." The family lunged toward me then. Their movements jerky and unnatural. I managed to wrench my arm free and bolted for the door. The younger sister tried to block me, her head twitching violently as she grinned. But I grabbed a candle from the table and swung it wildly, knocking her aside. I threw the door open and ran into the freezing night, the snow crunching beneath my feet. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, my lungs burning and my heart pounding. When I looked back, the house was dark and silent, its windows like empty eyes. The police found nothing. No house, no family, just an overgrown lot where the house should have been. They thought I was crazy, and maybe I was. But every night, I hear it, tick, tick, tick. Sometimes I feel a phantom grip on my wrist, unyielding and cold. And every New Year's Eve, the ticking grows louder. Story 7. A few years ago, I spent New Year's Eve downtown with my cousin James. We had a quiet dinner and decided to part ways early. I had parked in a multi-level parking garage a few blocks away. And as I waved goodbye to James, the streets were still buzzing with celebrations. But the further I walked, the quieter it became, until I reached the parking garage, a stark, echoing cavern compared to the liveliness outside. The elevator was out of order, so I grudgingly took the stairs. Each step up seemed to amplify the eerie silence of the garage. When I finally reached my floor, a chill swept over me, but it wasn't just the cold. Something felt off as I stepped into the rows of parked cars. My headlights were just barely visible in the distance. That's when I noticed the faint glint of broken glass scattered across the ground near my car. My breath caught in my throat. "No way!" I whispered, quickening my pace. When I reached my car, the driver's side window was shattered, and the door was ajar. Glass crunched under my boots as I peered inside. The glove compartment had been ransacked, papers strewn everywhere. My heart began to race. "What the hell?" I muttered, looking around for any sign of someone. Then, faintly, I heard it. A soft scrape of something metallic dragging against the concrete. I froze. The sound came from deeper within the garage, hidden between rows of vehicles. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No response. I edged backward, scanning the shadows. Then I saw it, a figure, low to the ground, crawling between the cars. They wore a dark hood. Their movements deliberate and unsettling. I couldn't see their face, just the silhouette. "Hey! Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The figure stopped. A heavy, suffocating silence filled the air. Then, slowly, they stood. The hooded figure was tall and gaunt, their posture unnatural. They raised a hand and pointed directly at me. "Leave!" A raspy voice hissed, barely audible but chilling. "Who are you?" I stammered, trying to keep my distance. The figure didn't respond, only tilting its head as if amused by my question. "This is my car," I added, my voice faltering. I'm not looking for trouble. Just let me go." The figure took a slow step forward, the scrape of their shoes echoing through the garage. "Trouble finds those who linger," they rasped. "Linger?" I repeated, confused and terrified. "What do you mean?" Instead of answering, the figure crouched low again, disappearing behind another car. I bolted for the elevator, punching the button repeatedly. The ding of the elevator felt like salvation. As the doors slid open, I jumped inside and hit the close button. I thought I was safe until the elevator began to descend. Halfway down, it jolted to a stop, plunging the interior into darkness. My breath came in ragged gasps as I fumbled for my phone's flashlight. Just as the beam flickered on, a low metallic scraping sound echoed above me. My stomach dropped. "No, no, no," I whispered, frantically hitting the elevator buttons. Nothing worked. Then, from the speaker above, a voice crackled to life. It wasn't the usual polite tone of an operator. It was raspy, distorted, the same voice I had heard earlier. "You shouldn't have stayed," it said, followed by a burst of static. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice breaking. The voice didn't answer immediately. Then, in a slow, deliberate tone, it replied, "To show you." "Show me what?" I demanded, but my voice barely carried over the oppressive silence. The elevator jolted again and began moving, but not down. It was going up. "No, no, stop. Where are you taking me?" I cried out. The voice crackled back through the speaker, to where it began. When the doors finally opened, I was back on the same floor I had started from. My car was still there, but the hooded figure was gone. Everything seemed untouched. As if the events of the last few minutes hadn't happened at all. I stepped out cautiously, scanning every shadow, every corner. "I'm leaving," I said aloud, my voice shaky. From somewhere in the distance, the voice replied, quieter now but still chilling, "You can't." I ran to my car, started the engine, and sped out of the garage without looking back. Later, when I told James about it, he suggested we check the security footage. But when we returned to the garage with the manager, he shook his head. "There's no footage," he said. "Cameras have been out for weeks. Maintenance issue." I still don't know what happened that night or who, or what, I encountered. But every New Year's Eve, I can't help but hear that raspy voice in my mind, whispering the same chilling question. "Why are you here?" Story 8. It was New Year's Eve, and after spending the evening at a remote cabin party with friends, I decided to head home. They all planned to stay the night. But I wanted the comfort of my own bed. Not wanting to risk driving after a few drinks, I booked a ride through a rideshare app. The driver, Andrew, had a solid rating. And his black SUV matched the description perfectly. When Andrew arrived, he seemed polite but distant, with an unreadable expression. "Evening," he greeted me as I slid into the back seat. "Hi," I replied, already settling into the silence. The snow outside had begun falling harder, casting a muted stillness over the night. For the first few minutes, the ride was uneventful. The heater hummed, and I absently scrolled through my phone. Then Andrew veered off the main road, onto a narrower, unlit path. I think you missed the turn," I said, glancing at the map. It showed us far off the highlighted route. Andrew glanced at me in the rearview mirror, his expression unreadable. "Shortcut. Trust me, it'll save time." My stomach twisted. "I'd prefer if you just stuck to the route," I said, trying to sound firm but calm. "You afraid of the dark?" he asked, his tone almost amused. "No," I said quickly, feeling my pulse quicken. "It's just late, and I want to get home." He didn't respond, his hands tightening on the wheel. The path grew narrower, the trees denser, and the signal bars on my phone vanished. "Why are you taking this road?" I pressed. "It doesn't make sense." Andrew sighed heavily. "You ever hear about that stretch of highway back there? People go missing all the time. Accidents. Ghosts, even." I stared at him, my unease deepening. "Are you joking?" He smirked, his eyes still fixed on the road. "You think I'm joking?" A chill ran down my spine. The snow thickened. The headlights casting long, eerie shadows through the trees. Then the SUV slowed to a crawl. "Why are we stopping?" I demanded, my voice rising. "There's something in the road," Andrew said, pointing ahead. Leaning forward, I squinted through the windshield. A figure stood in the middle of the road, a woman in a tattered coat, her head bowed low. She didn't move. Didn't react to the approaching car. "I'll take care of it," Andrew muttered, unbuckling his seatbelt. "No, wait," I said, panic creeping into my voice. "Let's just go around." But Andrew ignored me, stepping out of the car. I locked the doors the moment he was outside, my heart pounding. Through the windshield, I watched him approach the woman. She remained motionless as he spoke to her. Then, suddenly, she pointed at the car, her movements frantic. I cracked the window slightly. "What's going on? Is she okay?" The woman's head snapped up. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. "He's lying to you," she screamed, her voice desperate. "Don't trust him." "What does she mean?" I yelled, my hands gripping the seat. Andrew turned back toward me, his face unnervingly calm. "She's crazy. Don't listen to her." The woman struggled against him, clawing at his jacket. "He's not taking you home," she shouted. "He's taking you to them." "To who?" I screamed, but Andrew silenced her by yanking her back toward the side of the road. Her screams pierced the night, then abruptly stopped. Moments later. She shouldn't have been here in the first place. What was she talking about? I demanded. "Who are they?" Andrew let out a low sigh, gripping the wheel tighter. "People like her, they don't know what they're saying. Don't worry about it." "Don't worry about it?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You just dragged someone off the road." Andrew's gaze in the mirror darkened. "You should really stay quiet now." The SUV sped through the snowy path, the dense woods closing in around us. I reached for my phone, but it was gone. My stomach dropped as I saw it lying on the front seat. "Let me out!" I shouted, pulling at the door handle. "I'm not staying in this car." Andrew chuckled under his breath. Trying to keep my voice steady. Andrew turned off the engine and looked at me, his face eerily calm. "Wait here. Don't move." He stepped out, disappearing into one of the cabins. My breathing quickened. My phone was out of reach, and the doors were locked from the front. Panic set in. Then I heard a whisper. "Run." I froze. The voice came from outside, soft but urgent. I turned to see the woman from the road, her pale face illuminated by the moonlight. She stood in the shadows, her eyes wide with desperation. "Run," she mouthed again. Without thinking, I unlocked the door and bolted into the woods. The freezing air burned my lungs, and the snow made every step treacherous. Behind me, I heard Andrew shouting, but I didn't dare look back. Finally, I stumbled onto a main road, where a passing truck stopped to help me. The driver called the police, but when they arrived and we returned to the clearing, the cabins and the SUV were gone. No tracks. No sign anyone had been there. The police didn't believe me. They chalked it up to stress or overactive imagination, but I know what I saw. And sometimes, on cold, snowy nights, I still hear her voice whispering in the wind. Run. Story 9. It was New Year's Eve last year, and I had opted for a rideshare to get home after a small party. My friends were staying overnight, but I wanted the comfort of my own bed. I wasn't drunk. Just a little buzzed, and it was only a 15-minute ride to my apartment. The app notified me that my driver was 3 minutes away. His profile was normal, mid-40s, average rating, driving a black SUV. When the car pulled up, everything checked out, the make, model, and license plate matched. I slid into the back seat. The driver, a man with a thick jacket and a knit cap, gave me a brief smile through the rearview mirror. "Going to Willow Lane?" he confirmed. "That's right," I replied. The first 10 minutes of the ride were uneventful. The streets were quiet, with the occasional cluster of partygoers heading home. I stared out the window, watching the glow of streetlights blur past. Then, just as I relaxed into the seat, the car made an unexpected right turn. I glanced at my phone. The GPS showed we were veering off the suggested route. I think you missed the turn back there," I said. The driver glanced at me briefly. "This way's faster," he said curtly. "Trust me." Something about his tone made my stomach tighten. "But the app says we should go straight," I insisted. He didn't reply, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The car turned onto a dimly lit street flanked by old industrial buildings. The GPS on my phone struggled to update, the little blue dot jittering on the screen. "Can you just follow the route?" I asked, my voice firmer now. "Relax," he muttered. "I know what I'm doing." The unease that had been simmering now bubbled into full-blown alarm. The street was eerily empty, with no other cars or lights. I tapped on my phone to share my ride status with a friend. In the weak glow of the headlights, I saw a crumpled object lying in the middle of the street. It looked like a coat or a bundle of cloth. "Just drive around it," I urged. Instead, he pulled the car into park and unbuckled his seatbelt. "I'll check it out," he said, stepping out before I could argue. Panic clawed at my chest. Through the windshield, I watched as he approached the object. He bent down, reaching for it. Then he froze, his back rigid. A long moment passed, and he didn't move. "Hey, is everything okay?" I called out, my voice shaking. No response. Then I noticed it, movement in the shadows along the side of the street. Two figures emerged from behind a nearby dumpster. Their silhouettes tall and unnervingly still. They began walking toward the car, their pace deliberate. "Who are they?" I shouted, leaning forward. The driver didn't answer. His hand hovered over the object on the ground, trembling slightly. "Get back in the car!" I yelled, panic rising. "They're not supposed to be here," the driver muttered under his breath, almost inaudibly. Then, as if snapping out of a trance, he turned to face the figures. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice trembling but loud enough to echo down the empty street. The figures halted. Like a recording played in reverse. Return what was taken, the figure said. Driver's breathing became erratic. I didn't take anything, he stammered. What's going on? I demanded, gripping the door handle. Who are they talking about? The driver ignored me, his eyes darting between the figures and the object in his hand. Get back in the car now, he hissed. Not until you tell me what's happening. I shouted. Just listen to me, he snapped, his voice cracking. You don't want to know who they are. You don't want to know anything. The figures began moving again, faster this time. Their footsteps were eerily silent despite the uneven pavement. The driver dropped the object, and I caught a better look at it. A doll with an unervingly lifelike face, its glassy eyes staring blankly up at me. Get in the car, or they'll come for you too, he barked, rushing back toward the driver's seat. Terrified, I slid to the middle of the back seat as the car roared to life and sped forward. I looked back through the rear window. The figures had stopped again, watching as the car disappeared down the street. What the hell just happened? I demanded, my voice shaking. The driver's hands gripped the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. You'll be fine, he muttered. Just don't talk about this. Don't think about it. Forget it ever happened. What were they? What do they want? I pressed, but he refused to answer. Instead, he turned on the radio. The static filling the car like an unspoken warning. When we reached my building, I bolted out of the car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with my keys. Before closing the door, I turned back one last time. Who were they? The driver's gaze met mine in the rearview mirror, his eyes filled with something I couldn't decipher. Pray you never find out, he said softly. Then he drove off into the night, leaving me standing there, my heart pounding and my mind racing. I reported the incident to the rideshare company and the police, but no leads ever came up. A week later, I checked the app to see if I could find the driver's profile again. It was gone, erased as if he'd never existed. To this day, I don't know who those figures were, what the doll meant, or why the driver took that detour. But I haven't used a rideshare since. Story 10. The Shadows Beneath the Asylum. It was New Year's Eve, 3 years ago, when my friend Mark convinced me to explore the old Willow Creek Asylum. Mark was always the daredevil, thriving on danger and adrenaline. Me? Not so much. But I let myself get talked into it. We stood outside the asylum around 11 p.m., staring up at its crumbling facade. Man, look at it, Mark said. His voice filled with awe. Like something straight out of a horror movie. Yeah, great, I muttered. Let's just hope we don't become the victims. Mark laughed, clapping me on the shoulder. Relax. It's just a building. No one's here except us. He was wrong. The first floor was a wreck of shattered glass, broken furniture, and graffiti-covered walls. Mark's flashlight bounced off the jagged edges, casting eerie shadows that danced like specters. This place is a dump, I said, kicking a piece of rubble. Mark smirked. It's got character. Don't you feel the history? Sure, I said dryly. It smells like it too. We reached the staircase that led to the basement. Mark turned to me, his grin widening. Ready? I hesitated. Maybe we should just stick to the first floor. Eric, we came all this way. Don't chicken out now. With a resigned sigh, I followed him down. The basement was worse than I expected, colder, darker, and suffused with a pungent, rotting smell. Mark, this doesn't feel right, I said, my voice echoing in the cavernous space. You're letting your imagination get to you. He turned, shining his light ahead. Come on, let's check out those rooms. As we walked, our flashlights barely penetrated the oppressive darkness. Mark stopped suddenly. His light fixed on a pile of belongings in the corner of a room, blankets, cans, and a few odd objects. "Someone's living here," I whispered. Mark crouched, inspecting the items. "Probably a squatter. They're not here now. Let's keep moving." Before I could respond, a low, wet dragging noise echoed through the hallway. "What the hell was that?" I asked, my voice trembling. Mark froze, his flashlight darting around. "Probably an animal." "That didn't sound like an animal," I whispered. The sound grew louder, accompanied by faint whispers. "They weren't human, not entirely." "Eric," Mark said slowly, standing up. "Let's head back." Quietly. As we turned to leave, the whispers stopped. A deep silence fell over the basement. So heavy it felt like it was pressing against my chest. "Wait," Mark said, holding up his hand. "What now?" I hissed. "Do you hear that?" I strained my ears. At first, I heard nothing. Impossibly fast. Mark grabbed my arm. "Run." We sprinted down the hallway, the sound of footsteps behind us growing louder. Turning a corner. We ducked into another room and crouched behind a rusted metal cabinet. "What the hell was that?" I whispered, trying to catch my breath. "I don't know," Mark said, his voice shaking. "But it's following us." We both froze as the footsteps stopped just outside the room. "Mark." "Shoo." The faint beam of a flashlight swept across the room. Then we saw it, a shadow. But not like any shadow I'd ever seen. It was crouched low to the ground, its limbs distorted and too long. Mark leaned closer to me, his voice barely audible. "It's not human." The shadow shifted. Its head tilting as if it were listening. Then it spoke. "Why are you here?" The voice was deep, guttural, and filled with malice. My blood turned to ice. Mark's eyes widened, and he whispered. "We're leaving. Now." He grabbed my arm, and we bolted. But the shadow moved too, faster than should have been possible. "Eric, don't look back!" Mark shouted. We reached the stairs and scrambled up, but the voice followed us, echoing through the building. "You can't leave. Keep going." Mark yelled, his voice cracking. We burst onto the first floor and sprinted toward the window we'd climbed through. I threw myself outside, landing hard on the frozen ground. "Come on, Mark!" I shouted. Mark was halfway out when he stopped, his eyes fixed on something behind me. "Eric," he said, his voice hollow. "What?" I turned, and my stomach dropped. There, standing a few feet away. The window slammed shut with a deafening crash, and Mark was gone. I don't know how I made it home that night. The police searched the asylum but found nothing, no Mark, no belongings, nothing. Sometimes, late at night, I hear it again, the voice. "Why are you here?" And I wonder, was it asking, or was it warning me never to return?